Hello, this is Getting Started with SharePoint Framework Tutorial 1 HelloWorld WebPart. This is one of those tutorials which are available from the dev.devs.com/SharePoint related on client-side WebPart development. So you can either follow up on the written format in the dev.devs.com/SharePoint or have a look on the video and go through these steps one by one to understand how do we actually create client-side WebParts using the SharePoint framework. So let's actually get directly onto it. So I'm going to flip to my Windows 10 machine, which is waiting in here. This is a machine which I created in Microsoft Azure as a virtual VM. So, and it's a clean, I've only installed what's being mentioned as a prerequirement for the SharePoint development. In this case, I've already created SPFX folder to my root of the machine from where I'm going to then start completing the tutorials. So let's actually get ongoing with this one. So I'm going to create first a folder for my HelloWorld WebPart. And let's actually get to that folder as well. And let's clear the things. So we previously already, as part of the developer environment setup, we installed the Yeoman templates for SharePoint framework. So now I can actually start using them by calling yo at Microsoft/SharePoint. And this will then start essentially this template creation wizard, which will ask me certain questions and steps, which I can then adjust, or I can adjust the basic setup for my client-side solution. So let's actually use the basic, let's give it a name. So let's call that Hello World. And let's use the current folder as the structure for it. So that's fine. Let's actually have the WebPart name as Hello World as well, because we're just basically testing the basic setup of the client-side WebPart, and we don't at this point need to define the description. Obviously, all of these settings, well, except the WebPart name, especially description, is metadata for the WebPart, so you can adjust these things afterwards as well. We do take the WebPart name and that will be used actually in the class names which are generated by the template or Yeoman scaffolding by default, so that actually has a meaning. And at this point, we are asking one kind of an important question. So do you want to have any predefined, or do you want to have any third-party libraries by default available within your client-side WebPart? So we can always start by no JavaScript web framework, and then add React and Knockout and Angular and whatever on it. Or you can also use React or Knockout templates, and these will essentially create you a client-side WebPart and a dummy WebPart, which will then use the React or Knockout to render and to actually implement the client-side WebPart itself. But like mentioned, you can always start with no JavaScript web framework and then associate the needed libraries in as you move along in the development. So let's actually choose the no JavaScript web framework like in the tutorials, and this what will happen is that our template generator will now create the actual structure for the client-side WebPart. This does take a while, so it takes a few minutes to actually complete. So what happens here is that we are essentially creating the basic structure. For example, the source of the WebPart, it was called Hello World, and we are creating the Hello World WebPart TS file, as you can see over there. Then we're also installing all of the third-party dependencies, so those are getting pulled down from the internet to the solution itself. And since this will take a few minutes, depending on a machine, depending where you're located, let's actually pause the video at this point and continue whenever the scaffolding has been fully completed. Good. So now the generation of the solution is ready. And before we actually have a look on this one and test the generated by the default WebPart, let's actually do one more thing. So as part of the client-side WebPart development, we are serving quite often, or we are serving our content from a local host. And one of the things what we want to do to avoid any additional challenges is that we install a certificate, a developer certificate to this machine, so that we're able to serve the content from using the HTTPS. And this will then avoid any conflicts between HTTP HTTPS when we are serving the web part from a local host, even though we're accessing the web part, for example, in SharePoint Online. So let's actually do that. So let's execute gulp trust dev cert command, and this will essentially make sure that our developer certificate has been properly installed on this machine. So now, when you're executing this, it slightly depends if you're getting questions and verifications, and you need to obviously approve the certificate itself when that's actually happening. So slightly depending on a Windows version, depending on your machine, what you're using, or if you're using a Mac or a Linux to do the development, the experience is slightly different. Now at this point, we can actually already start testing the web part. So let me do gulp serve, and this will essentially start in quotes compile our client-side web part, which was generated by the Yeoman template, and it will then start a browser in the local host using the local workbench as well. So let's have a look on that one, how it actually works, and how the local workbench always also works as we test this web part out. So now, as you can see, we are actually in the local host, and it's in the local host as HTTPS, and that was the certificate which we were installed. So we're using HTTPS. It's a local host 34321 is the default port which we're using. You can actually adjust that within the solution settings. Now, this is the local workbench. We're not actually in a SharePoint Online, so I can actually do this kind of a testing and development even though I would be offline and I wouldn't have access on internet. So I can actually design and develop my UIs of the web part to the point where the web part has a dependency on something within a SharePoint or outside of SharePoint as well. But I can absolutely do some level of a development in a local workbench as well. And what's really cool about the local workbench is that you're able to already see the experience and test, for example, the configurations. And in here, what you're seeing is the modern property pane, which is the modern web part configuration property pane. In a classic web part modification UIs, you had a lot of settings, a lot of additional width and height settings, export settings, and a lot of additional things as well. And from an end user perspective, that was actually super confusing because it might have been really hard to spot which are the configurations and properties which actually has a meaning for that particular web part. So in the modern web parts, out-of-the-box web parts, and also the web parts which you can develop, we're using this modern property pane, which only shows those properties which are meaningful for that particular web part. And what's really cool about this one is also the fact that it's reactive, and that doesn't actually refer to React or Angular as a JavaScript framework. It refers to the fact that when I'm doing any modifications in my property pane, slightly depending on settings and a design of the web part, but by default, it is actually reflecting those settings to the web part itself. So if I write something in here and hello there, and let's get started. As an example, let's add that L there as well. You can see that it's reflecting the change all the time in the UI of the web part as well. So you're able to redraw the web part dynamically when we are adjusting the properties as well. This is a setting actually in a web part, so you're able to also have a non-reactive behavior, and what that means is that you will have an apply button in here. But you won't have that similar kind of a post-back experience like with an old classic web part in a web part development, which wasn't really that optimal to be fair. Good. So that's our kind of a quick intro on the client-side workbench. A few things maybe to notice here. So let's actually close the web part editor, and let's actually save the settings. We can say that that property is available even though we're in a local environment. One thing to notice here is that I'm able to also preview how my web part is behaving in a different screen size. So we're scaling the web part, and when you're using a client-side SharePoint framework in general, your web parts will be natively responsive, unless you do something super crazy within your implementation, like creating a tables with a fixed width and so on. So obviously those cannot be responsive because they have a fixed width. But by default in here, you're able to essentially test how your web part behaves in a different screen sizes. So how it's responsively aligning to the UI size of the page, which is pretty cool. Good. Let's actually close that one and let's flip back on our console. In my case, I'm just using a PowerShell console because I'm in a Windows 10 environment. That's on one option. There are multiple alternative consoles available, which you can actually use as well. So I'm going to do a Control-C. So I'm going to actually stop the execution. At this point, the local Node.js server is no longer serving like it was previously for the local host. So if I would be requesting that URL again, obviously there's nothing actually running. But the reason why I want to do this is that let's actually have a look on the code itself. So I'm going to start the Visual Studio Code by doing code and a dot, and that will essentially open up the Visual Studio directly within this folder structure. One thing maybe to notice on a Visual Studio, just to kind of pinpoint this one, when you're installing the Visual Studio Code, it actually gives you quite nice options as well. So it gives you options like add open with code option in the folders. So this one would be exactly the same experience, or opens up that folder within Visual Studio Code. And it also gives you additional other settings, which are pretty useful for your development. Obviously, you can use whatever developer tooling you prefer. So it does not have to be Visual Studio Code. It could be something completely different. So you could be just as well using Atom or WebStorm, or even Notepad if you prefer that one. Obviously Notepad isn't really that nice tooling, but it is, in the end, it's JavaScript, it's TXT, you can absolutely write and choose whatever environment you want to use. Now, let's have a look on the solution itself quickly, and let's have a look on what do we actually have within the solution. So which are the settings and what are the different configurations what we have within the solution. So first of all, you can see that there's quite a few folders generated by default within our solution. And the web part itself is found underneath the source, web parts, and there's our HelloWorld web part, which was automatically generated for us. In this case, we didn't actually use any we didn't use React or Knockout as the starting point. We could actually add them and start using them still. That's absolutely easily doable, just by adding references to those libraries and start using them. But this is essentially kind of a native JavaScript or TypeScript in this case. And the development happens in TypeScript. Whenever we, in quotes, compile, it's translated to JavaScript. So on a runtime, the browsers are always just natively handling JavaScript, but in the development time, we have nice benefits out of using the TypeScript, like previews and IntelliSense and all of these additional goodies. And that's really the benefit out of doing stuff in a TypeScript. Technically, you could actually do stuff in a native JavaScript as well. But the TypeScript is super useful, and it helps you to ensure that you're avoiding issues and bugs within your code as well. Few things to notice in here. So first of all, we have the web part props, and this is the properties of the client-side web part. So in this case, we actually saw that in the property pane as well. So in the property pane, we only had one text box, which was the description text. And this is defining what kind of properties do we actually have on the web part. Then in the web part rendering, we are actually outputting that this properties description. So that's outputting the value, and that was the reason why did you see this modified text in the web part when I was editing the property pane value. And then if we slightly scroll down, we can also see the property pane configuration. So this is the method and this is the configuration for the property pane itself. So let's quickly have a look on the property pane. So let's slightly adjust or further enhance the web part with few additional properties, so you can see how this actually works in practice. So let's add here property pane. Let's add that properly. Pane checkbox and property pane drop down, just to see how this actually behaves as well, and property pane toggle. Now I have a typo here. Let's actually fix that. So toggle there as well. So now we're importing these controls directly from the SB WebPart page, so you don't actually have to render those by yourself, obviously, which makes a lot of sense. So in our props TS, let's actually adjust this slightly as well. So let's add here a few test variable or test properties, so we can actually see how those values work then in practice. So test 1 would be a boolean, and test 2 would be a string, and test, now I'm actually doing something stupid. Let's add the semicolons here and not columns. Here we go. And test 3 is a boolean as well. Good, and there we go. And now we want to see how these are actually then rendered using those additional controls which we just actually added in to the client-side web part. So what we need to do is that we need to adjust the property pane configuration method. And the easiest way to do that, I'm going to save some time here as well. So I'm going to actually copy that directly from the tutorial documentation. And let's have a look on what I'm actually adding there. So right now we have the properties, the description only there. So let's actually hide that method, and I'm going to actually paste in the new version of the method as well, and let's expose that. And let's actually slightly adjust the styling of the method as well. So now we have the description still here. Then we're adding a property pane text field for the test property. Then we're adding property pane checkbox field for the test 1, property pane drop down for the test 2, and property pane toggle for the test 3. So test 3 was a boolean. This was text. This was a boolean as well. That was that test was text or string as well, and the description was already there as a string. So now if we want, we can absolutely also output some of these values directly from the render method. So in this case, our implementation is super simple. We're just outputting stuff directly in the render. So not necessarily the typical setup in the real world production web part, but something what we can do in the getting started status. So let's actually add here, I'm going to slightly adjust, let's not actually use that one, let's use this slightly different stylings. And let me actually be lazy and copy that directly from the tutorial, so we don't have to actually add that one in. So let's replace that one. So we're outputting here the test property value from the properties. So if I go here, we can see the test property, and we're outputting that one in our rendering as well. Good. One additional thing. So one thing that you should be also aware is the WebPart manifest. So this one is a really important thing as well. So the WebPart manifest is essentially, oversimplifying things, you could say that this is the .WebPart file if you are a classic WebPart SharePoint developer. Now there is, however, one pretty significant difference. The .WebPart files are essentially one pre-configured entry. So you can actually have multiple pre-configured entries here for your web part. So if I would actually take this one and do that and do a comma and add an additional entry, we would be able to have two different instances visible in the web part picker with a slightly different value. So let's add here something else. So this is an alternative instance of the same web part with a different default properties, and that's really important to understand. So you're able to have a multiple different default instances of the same web part. So I'm not going to actually do that. So let's actually concentrate what the tutorial itself is asking us to do. And the tutorial is asking us to actually update the properties section to add additional default properties for these new properties which we just added on the web part. So let me actually adjust that, and that's added in the property values. I'm going to paste that one in, and let's actually format the file as well. So the whole point here is that the default value for description when we're adding the web part on a page will be hello world. Default value for test will be multi-line text field, and default value for test 1 true, and so on. So you get the whole point of the functionality. Good. So now that our modifications have been applied, we've saved all of our settings. It seems to be looking pretty okay. And there's our props file. So we added 4 new properties. We're outputting that one property out in the render, and then we are exposing those properties in the property pane by updating our get property pane configuration value. And in here we added the default properties for the properties itself. Good. So we're ready to test how it actually looks like. So in this case, I'm going to just start gulp serve, and that's going to again essentially in quotes compile or transcompile the TypeScript, the JavaScript, and then it's going to open up the browser for me to see my changes on the web part. Technically, again, slightly depending, and we'll cover that in the future tutorials, you do not have to stop between when you're doing modifications, and I'll show you that one as an additional step in here as well. Now, if I add my web part in, and if I add my web part in here, we can easily have a look on that it's actually working properly. If I go here, we can now do we can see that our property values and the default values for the properties are working properly, and that's fine. In our tutorial, we're also asking you to quickly have a look on this one in the SharePoint context. So there is a workbench also in a SharePoint, and in my case, I'm going to actually use Office Dev PNP, which is one of my test tenants, and I'm going to jump onto the SPFX site in here. So this is actually just named as an SPFX site. It's an out-of-the-box theme site, nothing special behind of it. But when I'm requesting an underscore layouts and workbench ASPX, we are accessing the online workbench. So now we are in the SharePoint Online context. If we would have any customizations, which would be dependent on showing data from SharePoint, those would be working now properly. And we can also see the web part being actually available here. And we can also see the modifications of the web parts being available. And obviously, if I modify anything in the web part, we can see that modifications in the UI as well. Now, in here, it's really important now to realize that what we're doing is that we're serving this HTML or JavaScript directly from our local host. And that's really what the workbench is all about. So you're able to do development locally within your local dev box, but then serving that in the context of the SharePoint Online. So in this case, all of this content is directly arriving from the SharePoint, from your local workbench. And maybe one thing to notice here before we close up this tutorial. So if I switch to the code and if I come in here, let's actually do small modifications by adding here, welcome to SharePoint is the title, welcome to SharePoint framework. So let's add that one there. And before I save, let's do a quick side-by-side so you're able to see this one in practice. So I'm doing a save. What happens is that the Webpack recognizes, hey, there's a file changed within the file system. So therefore I will bundle your package, and I will serve that again for you in the UI. So now if I switch back on my browser and if I switch back on my local workbench, I can actually see the SharePoint framework modification already applied to my client-side web part. In the SharePoint Online side, we can't actually do that automatically. So if I delete this one and I add the fellow back in, we can see the modification directly in the page. Or let me actually add that, and let's refresh the page as well. There we go, and let's refresh the page. There we go, and now if we actually have a look on the HelloWorld, we can see the welcome to SharePoint framework chains being applied on the WebPart as well. But it's a really nice thing that from a local workbench perspective, I can do modifications side by side, and those modifications are immediately applied and visible when I'm designing my WebPart and making sure that everything is working properly. So learn more from here. Let's save that shedding modifications being detected. It's the solution is recompiled or transpiled, and then if I go to my client-side WebPart, we can actually see the button being automatically updated as well. So the development experience is pretty nice from that perspective. You're able to do development at the same time while you're serving, and you can see the changes side by side, and that's super, super cool. But that's it for this particular tutorial. So on the next tutorial, we will actually start talking with SharePoint. But let's close this video and move into the next one in the separate video. Thanks for watching, and please continue watching on the following ones as well.